All right. Sorry about the issues with the phone, but we're up and running now. And our first speaker, and first off, thank you for signing in here. I know that with the last minute delays and changes, it must have been difficult. So I really appreciate everybody turning out for this. It's really special, and we really appreciate it. The whole BioGears. So we're really excited for today and tomorrow. We're still going to have all the same talks that we had scheduled. The only difference being that the workshop that we had planned in our secondary room, we're not going to have anymore. Just really quick, my name's Austin Baird. I'm going to be speaking after Geoff. I'm the PI of the BioGears project. I'm the PI of the Burn Care project that we'll be getting into details of later today. But just really briefly, I guess, my background is a PhD in applied mathematics from UNC. I did a postdoc in mathematical physiology at Duke, and then I've been working at ARA since 2016. And I'm just really happy to be heading this project. I think it's a great project, and hopefully everybody agrees by the end of the day. So if you have questions at the end of the talk, just logistically, it would be nice if you could just type in the chat that you have a question, and then I can go ahead and unmute you, just so that everybody doesn't get unmuted at the same time and we have a lot of feedback. So, so just feel free to type something in chat. We will be monitoring chat all day, so if you have a few questions at the end of the talk, feel free to speak up, and then you can interact with the speaker. So let me just introduce Geoff Miller. He's an associate professor. I've known Geoff for maybe 4 years now. He's a great guy. He's an associate professor at the School of Health Sciences and a sim research at Centara Center for Simulation and Immersive Learning at Eastern Virginia Medical School. We're really grateful to have him speaking today. I think his experience with simulation, medical simulation, is really, really key, and is a great theme for this conference because, you know, BioGears hopes to integrate physiology into some of these simulations. So it's just really great to hear from an expert in the field. He joined EVMS in January 11, and he's overseeing the expansion of simulation-based educational activities, curriculum development and educational outcomes, and transitional analysis, with an emphasis on the creation and improvement of operational and clinical competence and assessment using advanced educational technologies, modeling, simulation, visual systems. He specializes in immersive virtual environments, augmented reality for remote medical care, serious gaming, and innovative educational technology development. He's also, well, yeah, he's worked for a long time at TATRC, and I think his future is also at a joint appointment there, but I can let Geoff fill in some of those details. But it's really great to have him, and so Geoff, I will unmute you and let you go ahead and speak.
Thanks, Austin. I appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the volume all right?
Yes, people are saying yes in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. I've got to dial in because my telework connection is not the greatest out here. So, but thank you very much. So we can go ahead and bounce to the second slide there. Before I get started, just as a quick disclaimer, yes, I've worked at TATRC since 2015. I am currently in what I call timeout. I'm pending a reappointment, and courtesy of all of the excitement going on in the world, paperwork and signatures is a little delayed right now. So I've been out of the office for 2 weeks, but should be back in shortly. So the views expressed here, again, are my own. They do not reflect policy of the Defense Department, etc. You guys can read that, but just my official disclaimer there of my current status. But yes, I've been at EVMS for a long time. Prior to that, was at the University of Miami, School of Medicine, where I worked extensively on pre-hospital disaster and military simulation with the Army Trauma Training Center as well. So I've had a fun ride with it, and it's been a big part of my life for a long time. So, and since 2015, I've had the opportunity to work very closely with the BioGears project. And I'd like to share a little bit about what we're doing, why it's significant to us in terms of military operational medicine, some of the projects and initiatives that we're taking on that incorporate this technology and others, and kind of more broadly talk about what I think this means writ large to the healthcare community and the medical and healthcare education, research, and development communities, which I think will be significant. Go ahead to slide 3. Another quick acknowledgement, there was a partnership between TATRC and ARA, the Primal Bio Project. I believe Dr. Brett Talbot, who's also listening in with us and will be speaking tomorrow, can talk quite a bit about this if need be. When I joined, this project was already underway, but it was really Dr. Talbot's leadership and being a thought leader and the investment in this type of system to help advance research and development efforts, medical modeling and simulation, and healthcare research as a whole. So just a quick acknowledgement on that, and I believe there's still ongoing efforts related to this, but just had to put that piece in as well. Slide 4. So for many years, and again, my background has been principally in academic medical education and research, but for many, many years, I've told people that data is my currency, right? As a medical educator, I don't generate a lot of clinical revenue because I don't really see patients. I don't generate a ton of research dollars because not a lot of people want to invest in educational research, and those funds are dwindling even further. So my data in terms of student performance, systems performance, and how we measure these things is critical to me. That's what I use to go to the dean every year and make an argument not for a budget reduction, but for a budget increase. So the importance of that is significant as a medical educator, and quite frankly, I think more people need to pay more attention to that. As a corollary, I think data is the currency of future science and discovery in the context that we'll be talking about today. And what I think is very significant, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in specific examples, is that the accuracy and integrity of these data will define the potential for these future solutions. And I think many of our future solutions will be first realized and appreciated through modeling and simulation before they're ever introduced into the real world. But by doing that, I think we accelerate solutions to the real world environment in ways that we haven't done before through traditional in vivo, in vitro processes. Moving towards an in silico model allows us enormous flexibility and speed in ways that we haven't seen previously. And we're actually seeing some of these examples play out real time with the biopharma industry right now in the response to COVID-19. I'm sure there's a tremendous amount of computational work going on around possible vaccines, et cetera, that might be able to move to market quicker or into the patient population. So I think it's really important for us to consider just how significant the data is that we're generating and that comes from things like BioGears and other computational models. Slide 5. So without saying, we all have lots of problems, but the military has some that are perhaps a little different or unique. Certainly, as compared to an academic medical center or a healthcare institution, which has a pretty confined and regulated operational space. The military's operational space is global. It's vast. It has great distances, and that generates a lot of problems for us. There's also a shift in a lot of things that are going on or predicted in the future that raise concern for us. So I'll discuss a couple of the key things we're talking about as we move to slide 6. So at TATRC, we spend a lot of time thinking more about the future than we think about the present. There are other research labs that work on things that are very much geared towards delivery of solution for today. So our mission is really looking and leaning forward and thinking about what would things look like then. And we list several examples here. We've got a new kind of novel example going on currently that would probably fall into the ChemBio realm there. But we have to think about how the operational context may shift in the future. So we've already mentioned that we have great concern over the tyranny of distance in operational spaces. We've had, it'll sound a little funny, but the benefit of working in fairly small operational areas such as Iraq and Afghanistan, where our access to casualty movement and evacuation all the way back to high levels of care back in the U.S. has been relatively rapid and easy. And that's led us to appreciate very positive outcomes in terms of combat casualty care and survivability. Now, that said, we still have problems there. However, in the future, we don't think that that advantage will exist as much. So we've got to come up with clever solutions to move more advanced health care further forward in the battlefield, but also thinking about all of these different types of problems that may occur, and then to think about where these things may happen. Will it be, widespread, low-density urban areas, or rural areas, or is it going to be, the megacity type of problem where you have high density and a lot of restrictions in terms of airspace and movement of people quickly to different levels of care. We can go to slide 7, please. So what are our possible futures? And this is where, again, we need to think about how data and how some of these computational modeling and simulation systems will help accelerate this. How do I develop next generation clinical decision support so that the young medic out in the field very far forward at a point of injury gets accurate real-time clinical decision support? Further, how do we do that in a way that may or may not have access to any type of communication? So how does this clinical decision support system function in the operational environment, and how does it do it with connectivity and without connectivity? So in a best case scenario, and we'll talk about a example of a project we're doing now in a little bit, how do I connect them with the trauma surgeon anywhere in the world that's immediately available? And in the worst case scenario, how does that system still support them, by referencing different computational models of a similar or same injury state or procedural process in a disconnected environment? We're also looking heavily at TATRC at different types of monitoring and sensing of patients, both near and close and from distance. We have a large group that's focused on surgical robotics and autonomous medical devices and systems. And it's not unique to us. There's a lot of people in the world that are working on these things. But again, I'm going to point back frequently that the data is significant here. When it comes to AI and artificial intelligence systems, one needs to keep in mind that the intelligence only as smart as the people who program it and the training data that is used to educate that algorithm. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. If you follow a lot of the AI development through different groups like Google, et cetera, we know that there are problems. Right now, there's a lot of reliance on crowdsourcing of the meta tagging of AI training data sets. And what we've discovered is that we've introduced a lot of bias into these data sets. So we've got to figure out a way to police those and curate them so that, when new AI systems come online, they don't reflect, whether it was intentional or unintentional, the whole spectrum of human bias that exists. And there are many different examples on that. But the big ones that have really gotten a lot of attention recently are systems used in the financial industry, the judicial sentencing system, these have big problems that they tend to discount minority populations or treat them a little more harshly. And that's of concern because many times a string of an AI or an algorithm that's been working and believed to be great gets moved forward and integrated into other systems. So, there's even more innocent ways of introducing bias as a result of that. So the data is significant, and how we curate that data and make sure that we're actually getting valid and reliable data for the training of AI systems is going to be significant, especially when we think about the high-risk environment of autonomous medical devices and clinical decision support systems. Many other things will come online, I think, in the future, as technology keeps driving some of this, whether it's, on-demand bioprinting for battlefield injury, some of the augmentation pieces that we're talking about, and we see some early examples of that through the use of augmented reality and different vision systems, ultimately nanotechnology, and then, of course, there's always the new and unknown. Things are moving quickly, and we know that there's going to be some surprises around the corner. Slide 8, please. This just kind of gives a quick overview of where we are, well, where we've been, I guess, where we are, and where we want to be. And this is just kind of a notional example. So right now, we have a bit of a problem that when you have a battlefield casualty, it's not a single caregiver. You could make the same corollary and analogy to what happens in the civilian healthcare side. So patient comes into the emergency room, they've had say they're having a heart attack. That's easy for people to think about. It's not just one person that takes care of that patient, so it's not a one-to-one caregiver ratio. We have the same problem on the battlefield. The bigger problem for us is that, it's removing other soldiers out of their operational mission, which is warfighting, and putting them into a caregiver mission. Approximately, 4 to 5 additional people are needed to care for a single casualty on the battlefield. So that's a significant impact the operational effectiveness and op-tempo of fielded units that may be engaged in warfighting. So how do we shift that? Well, we've got to create new systems that start to offload and deburden that ratio, where we can get a medic ultimately in the very far side, the light green. A single medic is able to care for multiple patients simultaneously through augmentation, use of technologies, automated systems, etc. But we also have to think about how that happens in both a connected and disconnected environment. And this is where a lot of the computational modeling, clinical decision support systems that are truly embedded and isolated from communication sources will be significant to us. So, learning how to accurately discover and curate what's really happening with healthcare providers in terms of performance, with injuries and injury patterns in terms of recognition, mapping, detection, etc., from a computational side or machine learning, AI, computer vision combination are very significant to us in terms of achieving this goal. Our other big problem is that we don't get to send researchers into the field to do traditional research, right? The opportunity for direct observation is non-existent. So it's very difficult for us, which also means we need to model and simulate these types of conditions inside of laboratory spaces or fielded environments for training. So lots of challenges, but our big one is trying to figure out how you can do more with less for more people with the same outcomes that we've appreciated over the last 15 years in current operational environments. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So this is a kind of a notional overview of where we're looking at going in the future. And it's not just TATRC alone that's doing this. We've got quite a few other partners through the services and also private and academic partners that are helping with this. But this is the spectrum that we're trying to achieve, all the way from the point of injury, and then how do we get folks back home healthy and well, ideally, but how do we get them back so that we can get them back to a good quality of life, I think, is the big piece. So not really meant to have you read everything on this slide, but it kind of gives you an overview of the large operational environment that we're concerned with. And as we get into this next phase, I'll talk about specific projects as it relates to point of injury training, point of injury care, and some other, I think, fascinating pieces that we're starting to do on the collection of data to develop more accurate models that will inform the future of autonomy, AI, robotics, etc., in a healthcare context. Slide 10, please. We've kind of alluded to a little bit of this. TATRC, the Telemedicine Advanced Technology Research Center, we've undergone an entire new missioning in the past year. Historically, TATRC functioned in several different ways, but principally as a funding and execution management group for a long time. That changed just prior to my joining, and they were remissioned as a laboratory. We have been remissioned again as we've changed different commands. We are now a standalone primary research laboratory and will be forming our own command shortly. But our main goal under this is to look at the fusing of data, humans, and machines so that we can optimize warfighter performance and casualty care. Again, our principal focus is really all of the healthcare that happens before the hospital. So it's operational medicine versus the fixed hospital-based medicine that occurs here. But a lot of this translates directly over. So we see a lot of opportunity to both from and inform the civilian healthcare sector. Again, our big lab focus areas right now are in artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, automation, and data, and how we work with that. Slide 11, please. So specifically, I work in the modeling, simulation, visualization, and informatics lab there. We have a new big mandate to look at human performance in healthcare, which I'll spend a bit of time talking about. But that also looks at, the tools and technologies that are used by humans in healthcare, the care they provide, operational medical systems, meaning, not a monitor per se, but how does the entire system from where a soldier is injured or wounded function to get them back to a higher level of care or operational field hospital or even back home. So it's systems-based analysis also, which is much larger scale modeling and simulation. There's certainly a big push for virtual and digital health. I think recent events are probably going to drive that even harder now as we look at how do we provide care with social distancing. I think there may be some benefits that come out of this current COVID-19 problem that will help inform this community in a much richer way. Again, medical robotics, autonomous systems, and data analytics, working closely with the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, or JAIC, that was recently stood up this past year as sort of the central research and development clearinghouse for the data that's being developed. Slide 12. We've adopted kind of a different approach to how we're doing this. So we've kind of worked with some of the human factors approaches. So our lab is specifically looking at human performance in healthcare. We look at it from both individual and team level. That incorporates, how tasks and procedures are done, how devices and tools are utilized, which devices and tools optimize performance, which devices and tools don't help. So we do a lot of comparative effectiveness of devices that are used, different devices used to treat the same problem, to look at how those are used by people and how it would optimize performance in the operational environment. So there's a big merging of many of these things simultaneously. We also are increasingly looking at the systems. Again, not just an individual person or device or just two people working on a casualty, but how does the pre-hospital system of care function currently, and then start modeling and simulating against that to try and figure out how we can optimize it. So There's a significant amount of analysis going on right now that I think will drive the discovery of the future, and then we kind of get into that completed loop as we run around this. Slide 13. We've gotten pretty serious, and don't try and read this. If anybody wants to see this, I'm happy to send out the full-size version. You got to print it really large to read it. But we've taken a pretty significant step in taking on a systematic analysis process. So we're able to, when we're missioned to evaluate something by command, we're able to plug it into this and follow a standardized systematic process so that we have data that we can compare back or forward as things go on in a way that we're kind of matching more apples to apples instead of apples to dump trucks. Unfortunately, a lot of things that are looked at, the processes are sometimes one-off or they start to drift. The tools for evaluation and assessment sometimes creep over time. And we're trying to narrow that because we think it's important that we really are comparing apples to apples, especially over time, because we know this is not a one and done. It will be a constant evolution of these technologies and the way we address casualty care in the future. So again, we're trying to get very serious about how we really curate and standardize the data moving forward. And that's where we think systems, like BioGears, are tremendously beneficial because they help create a digital standard for modeling physiology and casualty responses, et cetera. Slide 14. So we have a pretty dynamic research environment. This is to kind of give you an idea of the places and spaces that our modeling and simulation lab works in. We do work around manned and unmanned vehicles with one of our other labs in operational medicine and medical autonomous systems. Certainly, we're looking at theater care, particularly point of injury. We've got a group that focuses specifically on medical robotics. So, how do we give that medic in the field as a starting point, an extra set of hands, that would be guided or teleoperated by, perhaps another nearby medic who is not burdened or even further remote, leading to autonomy in the future. And then how do we deal with, the data that's required to do this? And that's a big challenge in the operational environment because we have limited communication bandwidth, we have limited communication integrity, and we have big distances to cover, so there's all sorts of issues with latency, et cetera. And this is where embedded models of procedures, et cetera, will be significant. So when we have failures of communication, it's not a failure of care. The care can continue through, local embedded models that the system can pick up from and run with. So these things are particularly important to us. So we also look at, in-route evacuation care, how remote support is done. So it's not just the performance of the medic in the field. It's also how do, these telehealth and virtual health remote experts perform. Because we've learned that, just because they said something really great that made sense to them in an embedded hospital system, it doesn't necessarily work or make sense to a medic in the field. So we have to optimize, both ends and the middle of these systems to make it work well. But we think that, one side informs the other, and then it flows back again. We have a mixture of both real environmental lab spaces. We've got different simulation sites that are really kind of more the tangible user interface side, mannequin, standardized patients, part test trainers, models, hybrid simulation, et cetera. We have a mixed reality lab that right now really relies most heavily on augmented reality, but we do have some virtual reality when it comes to medical robotics, et cetera. And then moving towards, the pure immersive environment, which we think will have, big opportunity on the training and education side of things as well. So it's a pretty cool and exciting area to work in. I find it very rewarding. I imagine that most of you guys do too in the work that you do. So, slide 15. I'm just going to kind of quickly move through some current efforts that we're engaged in that really leverage heavily on some of the data problems that we're talking about and systems that we're using right now to address these. Slide 16. The big area for us is patient-level modeling and experimental simulation. So we're going out and using different sources that we have, both civilian and military, to look at patient data for specific types of injuries, patterns, etc. Sometimes we develop an individual patient model, and we rely on things like BioGears to create the physiology to replicate the patient care record. And then sometimes we're looking at aggregate models. So everyone with this type of injury, what is the sort of sum of all vectors that's common, and what are the outliers that we need to consider and look at? And this is the information that feeds our simulation experimentation around human performance and comparative effectiveness. Again, some of this is done in tangible user interfaces. Some of this is done in virtual environments. We have another group within TATRC that actually just looks at high-level biocomputational computing of these things and development of models. So we're really focused on how do we get good data to inform good future direction. Because we look at this to develop new devices. Ultimately, I think this information will inform the pharmaceutical industry tremendously. We're already seeing it change the way some medical procedures and clinical practice guidelines are changing. Ultimately, I see a moment in time where we're able to pull data real time from a patient or casualty and put it into a digital twinning system, speed the thing up into hyperdrive, and game your patient as you're treating your patient. So instead of following just this guideline, as your way of treating the patient, what if you could game out 100 different futures in 1 minute of the way you might treat this patient, and then look at those 100 futures outcomes and say, path 19 is going to provide superior care. So I think there's tremendous opportunity, and it will get to the point where we will have the technology that can run and crunch those numbers fast enough to make a difference. So I see a neat opportunity there in terms of how we, can game patient care in a sense. And I mean that in a positive way when I say gaming, not a negative. So, slide 17. This is the area I don't think we've done quite enough on. So we've gotten good at modeling, with different simulators and physiologic engines, etc. Single patient. But I think it's high time that we start standing up servers where we have created entire communities or populations of people inside of BioGears that we feed and sustain, and we give them different backgrounds and different concomitant medical disease and problems and ages, etc. And we start to look at how things are impacting at a population level. There is some amount of modeling that goes on with this, and we've probably heard a little bit about it in the news with the modeling and predictive systems that are used looking at the spread of COVID-19 and other diseases. But I think there's a really rich opportunity to start to create these digital populations that can be used by different academic centers, research organizations, industry, etc., to help inform their decision-making about new procedures, devices, processes, etc. And I think this is going to be significant moving forward. This is an area that we're trying to get some additional support and funding for, because we'd like to create sort of a digital army, as it were, and then look at how we do this mass casualty care, what would the impact be, what are the different resources, tools, and technologies that we need to apply to make that result in better outcomes. So I think this is a huge opportunity, and it really leverages some of the work that's already been done with things like BioGears. But this is also going to take a lot more work, right? And I think that the way forward on that is crowdsourcing this future innovation, right? So we've got great tools that are immediately available to people to start building, but we need the community of interest, whether it's public, private, government, etc., to start contributing significantly to the further refinement and enhancement of the different models that exist within programs such as BioGears, so that we can get higher and higher and higher resolution of these digital entities that we want to use for experimentation. Slide 18. Another area we've been working on extensively the last couple of years is how do we project more advanced medical care into the field. So, we've had good outcomes for a long time in our current operational experience. However, there are many cases where we know we could do better. So we're looking at how do we do that. We can't put a trauma surgeon at the point of every injury, but we can move their expertise there, right? So by connecting them with connecting the medic with a trauma surgeon remotely and applying the appropriate pre-training and simulation-based training to teach them, more advanced new procedures, we can provide a higher level of care further forward afield, which, may impact outcomes. Again, this is still very early, but we're using augmented reality technology. We're starting to embed, some of the models onto the devices themselves. So if they lose connectivity, they still have this virtual, expert in their field of vision. And the systems are starting to look at and identify, problems with the casualty and start making recommendations and providing clinical decision support. But we're only able to do that through very high-end modeling and simulation. Again, we have a problem actually getting out and doing, direct observation in the field, and we have limited data sets that are returned to us, so it makes it very difficult to do, accurate work in this field without really relying heavily on modeling and simulation to make these things happen. Slide 19. This kind of gives you a quick overview. We have a remote surgeon on one side. On the local site, we've got that case, it's a Special Forces medic, in a fielded 10 environment. And you can kind of see briefly what they're doing, but we see a lot of additional potential here with the disconnected environment. So the system worn by the medic in the field would actually have, once they're developed, again, they're not there yet, but we need to build these things, but the system would be able to look at the injury, identify the anatomy, and then compare that to expert models that have been generated so that if they lose connectivity with that remote surgeon on the right-hand side, they don't get stuck. The procedure can continue and, hopefully result in the outcome that we desire. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we are with that. We've got real-time communication that we've been doing with the AR, and we're working aggressively to start building the models that will inform the disconnected environment. And that's where I'd like to go to on slide 20. This is our new big effort, human performance in healthcare. So we are doing a deep dive on the measurement of human performance, specifically in healthcare, related to real-time 3D psychophysiologic measurement of clinical procedural skills performed by individuals and teams. So if we go to slide 21, we'll start to dissect what do I really mean by that. We are doing a full broad spectrum analysis of what does right look like for given medical procedures. So this involves motion analysis, looking at how an individual does a procedure. We're isolating procedures. We're trying to break it down using hierarchical task analyses into what we kind of call micro skills to figure out what does right look like and ultimately be able to apply that back out to teams. But in terms of motion analysis, we're using the highest fidelity we could get our hands on right now. So we have a combination of optoelectronic, electromagnetic, millimeter wave, and 4K stereoscopic that's all simultaneously recording an individual doing a procedure to map out the 3D time-space model of their performance. So we collect hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these, of people doing the same procedure over and over by different people. And we start to aggregate this model to create a master model of what right looks like. In many cases, procedures are described by committees and boards. These are developed by consensus with people sitting in a room, but no one has really done a deep dive yet to develop these 3D time-space models. We think these are going to be significant also in how we inform the future of robotics and autonomy. Now, IBM Watson got really good at quiz shows because it could read lots of papers really fast, but future medical robotics with autonomy will not be able to benefit from that same type of training data. They're going to need 3D models to learn from and then be able to compare that back in person. If we move to the next slide, 22, also attaching to this full spectrum physiologic stress monitoring with real-time EEG monitoring, looking at cognitive load, task saturation, incorporating pupillary tracking for attention, distraction, focus, etc. Utterance tracking, so anybody in healthcare probably notices, or probably in any job, sometimes you utter little things that are clues to actually how you think you're performing, like when you mess something up and you make those fun little comments. So we're not just looking at the physical activity, we're also trying to really model and collect, what does right look like, not just from, where your hand should be at a given moment, but where should your sight be? How do you change your breathing patterns to optimize motion performance, etc.? So ideally, we develop all these models, curate them, and they also inform, many other areas that we're interested in. And we see this being a tie to the work that's been done in BioGears, because we're aggressively adapting physiology into this. So we'd like to see how we optimize the physiology of healthcare providers, much like other groups have done. So the folks that are in, explosive ordnance disposal, snipers, etc., they go through a lot of training on how to modify their personal physiology when they get into a high consequence, high liability situation. And we think that will be significant for healthcare providers as well. Slide 23. Another area we're looking at is how do we optimize the data? A lot of people are real excited about all these biosensors that we can put on a soldier, or we can put on a patient or a casualty, and it collects all this amazing data and it runs persistently. But we don't know that that really matters yet. Do I need to know the heart rate, cycling at 60 times a second, or do I need to know the heart rate only when it's significant? And this is where we're going to start working aggressively to, create these computational models and the physiology engines, and then figure out what is really needed to optimize casualty care or patient care in terms of what is the frequency of data transmission for a given physiologic indicator that is significant and informative to a healthcare provider versus just persistent monitoring where you have information overload. So this kind of gives you a brief overview of that. It's significant in the military context because, again, we have limited and disrupted communications frequently and a very low bandwidth. May not be the same in a civilian system, but the information overload and the cognitive saturation is significant to both groups. So we're trying to figure out how you deburden that cognitive load and task saturation, information saturation, to optimize a caregiver's performance. 24, please. Again, I think most of what we're trying to achieve, and I'm going to start wrapping it up here, is that data science is going to help us get to these solutions. And I think it's bidirectional. Our big focus is on that left-hand side where it's the fielded operational environment. But that data is informative and supported by the right-hand side, which is our, more traditional fixed facility. And in the middle, we're going to have to rely on, very accurate systems and models that can, pick up and detect the things that sometimes the human can't and provide expert guidance on it. So on the final slide there, 25, coming back full circle, I think data is our currency, but I think it's going to be just amazingly significant to look at the accuracy and integrity of this data. And this is where systems like BioGears and other computational models for healthcare are going to be important to us, but they'll only be significant if they're accurate. And that's where we have to work with each other and start really checking each other's work to make sure that we're not introducing bias, etc., and that we're getting large enough samples of variation of clinical presentation, of patient types and people, ethnicities, etc. But I think if we can start to create a standard model for how we go about doing this, we will achieve these future solutions. And with that, go to 26. I know I pushed right out to my time limit, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Geoff. That was really great talk. We really appreciate it. I think that you brought up a lot of great points, and I love the bidirectional nature of from field operation and then training and modeling and sim on the other side, and how those things connect to each other. So, if anybody has any questions, they can post them in the chat. And it looks like William has a couple questions, so I'll unmute you really quick, William, and you can interact with Geoff. Okay, go ahead. You should be unmuted.
William, you're unmuted.
Oh, okay. I thought you were just going to read what I typed. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I figure you and Geoff can interact, so I'll mute myself now so you two can talk.
All right. Very, very excited about the talk. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Awesome graphics and illustrations. Just to put some quantification on the data part of your talk, which you emphasized up front and at the end, could you give us a sense of scale about how much data unitized to a particular soldier that we're talking about, that that might be involved with personalizing these models, whether or not they're called digital twins or at the procedure level or something like that, and how that's being weighed with other assets that the DoD has, which also has a liability to either securing it or just managing it over the life cycle of that service member, starting in the military and being handed over to the VA.
Gotcha. So I would say the current state is that the amount of data that's gathered on any individual is probably very similar to a comparable individual in the civilian environment. So they do get a little bit more screening during their career in service, and certainly pre and post deployment that your otherwise, healthy 23-year-old civilian probably doesn't get. But it's not much larger right now, so there isn't very much in the way of monitoring during deployment going on. There's a big interest in it. This is coming down from the highest levels to start to understand warfighter performance. There's a big piece looking at just their performance in general. There's concern about whether or not they're getting enough sleep to optimize performance, their nutrition intake, fluids, hydration, etc. So there's been, I think, more work done in the areas of nutrition, hydration, sleep, and overheating, exhaustion than there has been on the medical side. But there is now a new directive as of the end of last year that we're supposed to start marching toward figuring this out. A lot of people are quickly saying, well, we can just put a wristwatch monitor on everybody and send them out. But as you allude to, there's some problems with that. So there's some data sensitivity, security. Anything that can help inform us can also help inform an adversary if they're able to get into it. And we've got to make sure that we're doing that right. That also leads, that is, there's a trust issue with many of these things. So we've got to overcome that barrier too, and that's the people that are going to use and wear these devices and that know that their information is secure, that they can trust that the right things are being done with it. I don't think it's terribly dissimilar from some of the trust issues and discussions we're having around AI and even autonomous vehicles. There's some people that embrace this. There are others that are very concerned about it. So it's a big problem. My other concern is that, until we really understand how much data is needed and the frequencies, persistence monitoring is just not realistic. We don't have the capability or bandwidth to do that on a large cohort of people in the field and send things back real time, all the time. I don't know if anybody remembers the movie Aliens 2 when they're going in to figure out what's going wrong at the base there. you see the commander is looking at all their physiologic feedback real time. We don't have that capability, but we should be able to figure out when we need to know and then what the frequency needs to be based on severity of conditions. So I don't know if that answers all of your questions, but that's kind of where we are with a lot of this right now.
Great. Thanks, Geoff. We'd love to get your contact info and continue offline. This is a really tough problem.
Yep. Yeah, I put my academic email on the last page because my military one is in timeout right now also. But these slides, I think, they're available to you guys depending on how Austin and the team are going to get things distributed. But it is there, so you can catch me that way and then connect through the other email once I get that going again.
Thank you very much.